The role of prices. We see prices every day. We see them all the time. And none of us, or very few of us, most likely, like high prices. There's nothing to like about the fact that something we have to pay more for, we have to give up more to get it. But really, we need to look at where prices come from. What are prices? How do prices get determined? Is it just arbitrary? Can you set a price on anything? What does a price actually mean? And most importantly, what kind of information do prices communicate? This is one of the overlooked aspects of prices is that prices communicate information. Prices are signals. They send signals to people in the economy and that allow us to coordinate and make decisions in a peaceful and orderly way and actually can provide for a pretty sophisticated economy. But we have to understand the basics. In the last PowerPoint video in this series on the introduction to economics, talked about the first rule of economics is scarcity. First rule of economics is scarcity. Scarcity is a reality in the world of limits, limits on resources, limits on whatever it may be, that we want more than there is. Our capacity as humans for wants is infinite. We can constantly want or desire more things or need things, but there are limits. And scarce resources can be used on alternatives. So, for example, you get milk from a cow. That milk can be used for drinking milk, can be used for cheese, can be used for ice cream, can be used for sour cream. How do we know what the right amounts of those things are, or how much should be made for certain purposes? To take something, it can't all be milk, it can't all be sour cream, it can't just be 1/4. What's the appropriate amount according to demand? What are people's needs based on these things? How do we know what people we want? How do we know that if we're the ones providing the goods, what people want, how much they want, and what the appropriate amount is that they want, that we're even serving consumers well? Or when we want something, how do we know what our choices are in relation to having those things? So scarcity is rule number one, and prices factor into that. There's also another early rule of the principles of economics, which is opportunity cost. Opportunity cost goes hand in hand with scarcity because opportunity cost is the idea that in choosing something, we give up other things. In choosing something, we give up other things. So by choosing to, let's take time, this is a fairly simple example. Choosing to sleep an extra hour, there's nothing right or wrong with that, but choosing to sleep an extra hour, we have given up other things. That's what opportunities cost. By spending $5 on McDonald's, that's $5 you can't spend on everything else, and that's your opportunity cost. We also have to look at where prices come from, which we'll look at in the next lecture or next few lectures, talking about valuation. How do we decide what the right price of something is? Because a lot of times people will say, well, that's too high, or the price would be irrelevant to them if it's not an item that they want to buy. But anyway, let me talk about the basics of prices. So a fun game or TV shows, the Price is Right, where people come on and they try to estimate the correct prices of an item without going over. So prices deal with the economic reality of scarcity. And prices also determine what, when, and where resources get used. And they determine these things in a peaceful and orderly way. Otherwise, it's just arbitrary. It's just by force. It's just by command. It's just by somebody authoritatively being in charge of someone else or other people telling them how resources get used. Prices are a way to coordinate the system and to make use of limited knowledge as well. Because we don't know what the specific needs are of everybody in our community, everybody in our state, everybody in our world, and prices help us figure out the means to those ends and where the most urgent needs are for resources. Now, here's a question I commonly ask that talk about why people don't live on beachfront property or private islands. And this has to do with the economic reality of scarcity and how it ties into price. Now, assuming that most or all people want to live on the beach or want to live on private islands, what is the thing that prevents them from doing so? Well, a lot of people would say, and they're correct, that the price is too high. But why is the price too high? Why is the price of beachfront property so high? Well, it's because there's limits. The limits of scarcity and lots of people wanting it, and increased demand means higher prices. So therefore, land that's very desirable, that lots of people value and value at the same time, increases prices. Now, we're not talking about the theory of who acquires the land and how does the land become property or something that's sellable in the first place. But the fact of the matter is there's a limitation on what is available, and there's more people that want it than there is availability. And so that causes a high price. So even in terms of, there's a show called Star Trek that some people like, that you're usually either a Star Trek person or a Star Wars person. Some people are both. But Star Trek was supposed to be set in what's called a post-scarcity society. And there's really no such thing as a post-scarcity society in that literal sense, because there's still limits on things like private islands, beachfront property. Now, what they meant was that there was a superabundance, which that is possible, but there's usually not this type of idea of no scarcity at all, at least in a fallen human world. So prices, how do prices help? Well, none of us like high prices, but prices guide consumers in their decisions. Well, think about, how do prices guide us? How do prices direct our actions without anybody authoritatively telling us to do one thing or another? Well, we look at prices and think about the decisions we make. Think about if a price increases or a price decreases, how we and others tend to behave and the decisions that we tend to make under those conditions. Prices guide us as consumers in our decisions of what we're going to buy, when, how much, and when prices increase, we behave a certain way, or we tend to behave in a certain way. When prices decrease, we tend to behave in a certain way. So, for example, a person who wants it more and is willing to sacrifice other things, let's take toilet paper, for example, right now, they'd be willing to pay a higher price than someone who's not willing to pay that higher price and wait. And therefore, the resources get allocated to where they're most urgently needed in an imperfect sense. So as a rule, when prices are higher, people will buy less. And if prices are lower, people will buy more. Now, we know this to be true. We observe this in our own behavior. We intuit this about the world. We can observe this, but this is a very key factor in understanding economics and economic behavior. And it's also one of the reasons why it's very difficult or impossible to legislate into existence something that will control prices in a stable way, because if prices are not flexible, it doesn't change human incentives and human behavior. Prices also guide producers in their decisions, people who are making stuff, uh, providing goods and services because of a profit motive. In order to make a profit, in order to benefit from what they're doing, they have to provide things that consumers want. And the consumers have to vote in a very direct form of democracy with their dollar to indicate that they're being served well. The prices also guide producers in another very important way. There's a great article that's entitled "McRib and Economic Calculation." McRib and Economic Calculation, which I have students read along with introducing prices on one of the first days of economics. And what what this article discusses is we all probably are familiar with the McDonald's McRib that comes back every so often to McDonald's. Now, a lot of people think the McRib comes back every year on a regular annual basis, but actually, that's not true. If you look at, and this article has a chart indicating this, and I may even have it in one of these PowerPoints. If you look at it, it's actually based on the fluctuation of pork prices. Now, the producers of McDonald's, they realize that it doesn't make economic sense. It doesn't make them profit to produce the McRib all the time, like it does other items on their menu. Like the Big Mac is always there, the fries are always there, soda is always there. So they decide based on if pork prices are above, at, or below a certain amount. I think it's like 50 cents a pound, but it doesn't really matter, the actual number, but the principle is what matters. Now, when the price is higher, what that is indicating to the producers at McDonald's as they're considering whether or not to bring back McRib is when the price is higher, it's not worth it for them to do it. But what the price is also communicating to them is that that pork is being used more urgently somewhere else in the economy. It's where it's needed more urgently somewhere else in the economy, and it's needed there at a higher level than they need it to make the McRib. Then, at another time where pork is more abundant, there's less demand on it, and the price comes down, McDonald's or the decision makers at McDonald's look at it and say it would make economic sense for us to bring back the McRib because we can make a profit. Now, without these prices, producers would have no way of knowing whether or not their actions are serving the consumer or not. And they would have no way of knowing whether or not the way that the means to the end of from the beginning to the end of production when they make the sale, they would have no way without prices of knowing whether or not what they're doing is efficient. It becomes impossible to calculate whether or not their actions are actually serving the people whom they intend to serve without prices and profit motives. So prices guide producers in their decisions. How will producers know what millions of people want? Changing minds, changing conditions, people wanting different things for different reasons, all, as I'll argue later, on a subjective basis. How will producers know what millions of people want? Well, they judge by prices of available goods, demand, and profits and losses. It's not just a profit system, it's a profit and loss system. They're motivated to not only pay for the materials that go into making the products, goods, and services that people want, but they also want to make more money back from that. They want to be rewarded for serving people well. And so that's called profit. But equally important is the loss. The loss tells them that they are not serving people well and that they have to change, or the resources which they currently have charge over will move into the hands of someone who will utilize them more effectively and serve people more effectively. And so this is how prices guide producers in what to produce, not just us as consumers. And producers have the same motive. When the price of something is higher, they tend to buy less. When the price of something is lower, they tend to buy more. Or they calculate the cost like we all do, and they have to give up something in some other form. So profits encourage producers to keep producing. Losses discourage producers from producing. This is an episode of Spongebob where it's called One Crab's Trash, and it's where Mr. Krabs is having a garage sale, and he's trying to sell junk at his garage sale, literally from the trash can. And he finds this hat, which at the time he doesn't know is a rare hat that not a lot of people have. And so he sells it to SpongeBob for some amount, $5 or something like that. And SpongeBob gets it. And then after he makes the sale, SpongeBob goes off with the hat and someone else comes up to the yard sale and offers Mr. Krabs a bunch of money for the hat. Then another person comes and offers even more money. Then another person comes and offers even more money. And he realizes he gave up this hat that's worth a ton of money. And so he tries to, throughout the episode, trick SpongeBob into giving him back the hat, which he eventually does. And then he comes back to his yard sale where these people buying this hat or were willing to buy the hat before, they're still there. He says, okay, let's start the bidding at $1 million. And that's what this picture is from. And they all start laughing at him. And he's confused. And they say, okay, they thought he was joking. And they explain to him that the hat is actually worthless. The hat, they found a warehouse full of them. And so the hat is not scarce. The hat is not rare. But this illustrates a bunch of economic principles. One, it illustrates the idea of demand and scarcity and its effect on prices. When they thought the hat was, number one, scarce, number two, valued, there had to be multiple people valuing it, creating a demand for the hat. This caused the price of the hat to increase. Over the course of the episode, the price of the hat goes from $5 to $500 to $1 million to $1 billion, whatever it is. And then at the end of the episode, the hat is worth nothing at all. And so it becomes subjectively, the value has changed, the price has gone down. And so the price that one is willing to pay becomes the price that someone else is forced to pay. If I offer somebody has a bag of chips, I offer them $1 and they're willing to sell for that, they can sell it to me for $1, but if someone comes around and offers them $1.50, now the price, unless they want to agree with me to $1 for some other reason, the price has increased to $1.50. So the intersection of scarcity, subjective value, and demand for an item creates a price. And where do those prices come from? Because there are some things, as we'll see, that people have different valuations for. I like to use the example of Amazon's pet rock. That pet rock was a thing in the 70s and 80s that people bought and sold. But if you look on Amazon, I have a link for it in my syllabus, my schedule notes for this class. Pet rock runs on Amazon for $20. Now, economics is subjective in the sense that it's value free. It doesn't tell you what you should or ought to do. It doesn't tell you what are called normative considerations. It doesn't instruct you. All it does is talk. It's supposed to be an empirical science. Now, empirically, I would value a pet rock at 0. I wouldn't buy a pet rock. So subjectively, to me, the value of a pet rock, the price is 0. But for other people, their intersection of demand and someone who's willing to sell it, they find a negotiated price based on around about $20. So what's really the worth of a pet rock? Is it 0 or $20? Well, that's another thing to talk about where price comes from, and we talk about theories of value. But as this episode of SpongeBob illustrates, that the price can change. The price that one is willing to pay becomes the price someone else is forced to pay. Now, resources tend, on this basis, to flow to their most valued uses. Meaning, like the example I gave before of the toilet paper, if someone's more desperate, they're willing to give up other things and pay a higher price for the toilet paper, therefore bidding up the price. The toilet paper will move toward where it's most urgently valued. Same thing with the pork and the economy in my example with McRib. Prices also coordinate the use and the flow of resources. Prices coordinate, they organize the system in a very sophisticated and flexible way, the use of resources. So price coordination prevents producing too much, which is waste or overproduction, or producing too little, which is a pretty amazing thing for an economy to do, because if you think about having to produce the right amounts of goods and services, which can change minute by minute, just for your town, and let's say you had the ability to decide what these resources were going to be, what their amounts were going to be and how much of each household was going to get each one, this would be a pretty difficult, if not impossible, task for you to do. But prices prevent waste and overproduction, and they also prevent shortages. Now, if a price is set artificially too high, you're asking for too much for something that's not equivalent to the demand on that resource or the scarcity of that resource, then the price is too high, and what happens is too much gets produced, waste or overproduction. And if the price is set too low, people keep buying, and what happens often is there's running out. Sometimes both of these things happen in an economy at once. So, for example, 1970s, there were gas shortages based on things going on with the Middle East and Iran and Saudi Arabia and all kinds of things during this time on an international level. But it wasn't that there was a shortage of gas and oil per se. There had been less gas and oil in a literal sense before, and it didn't produce these problems. But what had ended up happening was there were set price controls on gas and oil, and the prices were set artificially too low, which caused shortages in some areas, and the prices were set too high and caused overproduction in other areas. So you had long lines and rationing of gas. Same thing happens with power. It happened in California in the 2000s. There were shortages in power because of the same thing. It happens in California because of water. There are shortages in water because the prices are set too low. And so it goes on and on, but prices reflect the economic reality of scarcity. And if they're not allowed to be flexible, what you end up have happening is when prices are set or locked in artificially too low, when prices are lower, people will buy more. But if there's not literally more of that supply, then people can run out. Opposite, equal opposite is also true. If a price is locked in artificially high, what ends up happening is people buy less, and you end up making too much and having all this stuff, all these extra resources lying around that are not sellable, and sometimes both. Same thing can happen with something like rent. Rent control, the law sets the prices artificially low and doesn't allow them to rise to what they otherwise would be. Lower prices mean people buy more rent, buy more housing than they otherwise would. And then there are shortages. So you end up with people, long lines or lists of people to get into housing, taking a long time, people going out of the housing business, landlords quitting, going out of hand, being landlords, all sorts of effects beyond just the intended effect of the law. And we recognize this. When there was a gas tax, or when there is a gas tax, we recognize that it's to try to get people to buy less gas. When there's a cigarette tax, we recognize it's to try to make the price of cigarettes higher, that people will buy less cigarettes. But then that same logic, though it is valid in that sense, is not applied to things like rent control or minimum wage. Minimum wage doesn't mandate the hiring of anyone. It just makes it illegal to work for less than a certain amount. And so all it does is mandates a higher price for employment, for legal employment, and makes it illegal for certain people to work, which usually leads to other things being equal, some people being benefited from it, and increased unemployment for others. So that's a shortage in labor, an overproduction of labor. It's the setting of the price artificially high so that people buy less and less is used. In the Soviet Union, they often had unsaleable goods piling up in warehouses while people waited in long lines for the goods that they wanted. So there are real world examples in which this can happen. Price controls during World War II were common when resources were going to the war effort. There were limits, and so often people would be accused, if they raised their prices based on scarcity, of price gouging. They were said they were taking advantage of people being in need. But the reality was, and philosophically, there are problems with that because if the customer has a choice uh, not to interact with the business, and the business has a choice not to interact with the customer on a basis that is not voluntary. But even stepping aside from philosophically, just because the law steps in and mandates lower prices, the only thing that that can do is keep the prices low legally and cause people to buy, usually leading to shortages. So price control is usually introduced to keep prices from rising like they normally would under normal supply and demand, but prices rise and fall. And so usually what happens is prices rise because the amount demanded exceeds or is more than the amount supplied at existing prices. So the appropriate thing in that situation would be for the price to rise. Now, if prices remain the same, what will happen, all other things being equal, is a shortage. Now, prices fall because the amount supplied is more than the amount demanded at existing prices. So there's more available. There are less people that want it, which would mean the price would appropriately come down. But if the price is not allowed to come down, like in minimum wage or something of that nature, there's a surplus. There's leftover labor or goods or services that it's just that no one's buying. Rent control in Sweden, here's an example of uh, how the government mandating by law, legislating low rent prices, not allowing rent prices to go up. And I've written a lot of papers on this as well about the secondary effects of this, not just the immediate, but cause shortages in housing. Now, it doesn't literally cause there to be less housing, but in 1940, there were 6.3 million people in 1.9 million dwelling units. This is about 31 housing units per 100 people. So this means more people are living in less housing. So this means 2, 3, 4 people living in a house. Then in 1965, 36 people per 36 housing units per 100 people. Waiting time for getting a place to live also rose because of rent control. In 1950, there was a 9-month wait list for a house. In 55, a 23-month, almost 2-year wait for housing. 58, a 40-month waiting for housing. Now, what this is the effect of rent control. Rent control caused the prices of rent to remain lower. More people purchased housing, and this made the availability of housing shrink. Now, just because there was less, the houses didn't necessarily go away, but what happened was more people were using housing than if the prices had been allowed to rise. So there was no greater scarcity, but there was a real shortage. Same thing, under socialism, prices do not transmit accurate information. And that's not because socialists are bad people or anything of that nature, or that the people in the system are bad or corrupt any more than anybody else. If we assume they're all good people, that's not the issue. The task is still impossible because they don't have a price system sending signals, guiding them into the economic realities. And so prices have no basis in economic reality, that is to say, scarcity. And so when people think something is free, they often want more of it, causing shortages, overcrowding, and rationing. The USSR, the former Soviet Union, enterprises in the USSR developed the habit of asking for more than they need because they didn't have a guarantee of continued resources. So the Soviet Union, though it did not lack resources, had often shortages because of this economic system. Same thing in the California drought. 2015, Jerry Brown ordered the city and county governments to enforce a reduction in water usage by 25% with a threat of a $10,000 fine per day for non-compliance. But the problem with water in California is the price was not allowed to rise. If the prices of water were allowed to rise, people would make different economic decisions. But with the prices being kept low, all they can do is try to tighten the laws on people and tighten the fine and the enforcement on people to try to get them to behave differently. But if the price remains low, there's not really a signal, not really an incentive, not really a reason for people to behave differently, except for the enforcement of the law or some type of fine against them. In another video where I talk about prices and water, I bring this out a little bit more in a little bit more detail. Now, along with that, in 2015, when California was under its drought or near drought conditions, this did not stop as I just read, the threat of a $10,000 fine per day. But also, in addition to that, at the same time, the government pumped several million gallons of fresh water into the ocean to comply with government environmental goals. Now, these are two different aspects with different goals of the government trying to work at different purposes. But the point is, there's no price coordination informing the system about the economic realities of scarcity. So at the one hand, you've got one aspect of the California government fining people $10,000 a day, trying to get them to use less water without having a system of prices rise and communicate the lack of scarcity of water. And then on the other hand, you've got another aspect of the California government pumping millions of gallons of fresh water into the ocean. And so this is not because they're bad people. This is because of the lack of signals in the system, because of the lack of prices, because prices fill a vital and essential economic goal of communicating to us information and knowledge that we would not and could not otherwise have without them.